Dear Lord, we want our attitude to be one of gratitude. You have given us much. When we think of your grace and goodness, we are humbled and thankful. Today, let us express our gratitude, Father, not just through our words, but also through our deeds. And may all the glory be yours. Amen. Amen. Because we're starting a new year, so to speak, our new year, after a summer, which I hope everybody had a good one. And I'd just like to introduce the committee for those of you that are new. First of all, Jane Warren is our treasurer. Very experienced. I'm not even going to ask how many years anybody's done this job. Jane will always have a basket on the table where you sign in and get your name tag for donations to help provide for our speakers, for our books, everything. So thank you, Jane. Jane Blackburn, the hostess with the mostest, has her list ready, and some of you have signed. She's going to pass it around again in case people signed in at one end of the table and didn't notice there was something on the other end. So you have an opportunity to sign up for hostessing for a month. Generally, 2 people work together. You can do it however you want. You can have 3 if you want. We don't care how many, right, Jane? No. And I would like to just give credit to Jane, who helped today, and to Lucy, who did the baking.
And the staff sets up the table beautifully every once a month for our meetings, and the hostesses usually share the expense of the cake. And I don't work for HEB, but just as an example, a half sheet, what HEB calls a half sheet, is more than adequate for almost all of our meetings. So with those 2 things, we're looking, and I will send this around, meeting October next month.
Thank you, Jane. Willie, there you are, Willie. And of course, Willie's who you hear from every month. And those of you that are new or just visiting, and I'll get to you, Ellen, I haven't forgotten you back there. If you'd like to be getting emails telling you what's going on with the circle, why, Willie takes care of that. So make sure she has your email so that she can do that. Shelley Bass is not here yet, and I'm sorry, she's in charge of our book selection. I think she may still be slipping in. She hasn't said she wasn't coming, so I'll just mention her name and we'll let it go at that. We have Ellen. Stand up just so they can see you. Ellen Fraser is a new member. She called up, she didn't say I want to be a guest, she says I want to join.
Exactly.
So we have a new member. And who else do we have? Allison?
Yeah.
Are you a guest or are you joining us?
Oh, I'm joining.
Excellent. Yay.
Last year, but it was just so thankful.
Thank you very much. Good to have both of you ladies.
Thank you.
Just a little WOC news, which I need to pass along, is the September Luncheon is the most immediate thing, which is the last Monday of this month. And most important, this coming Monday is when they close off reservations. So I have left cards back on the sign-up table for you. If you're interested and you haven't gotten a ticket, you can still pick it up this Sunday or online. And so if you're interested and would like to just read about what the program is, pick up a card and read it, take care of that. I have brought some new membership books for this year. These are for people that are not, if you were counted in another circle as a member, they have got a book for you. For the people that are not members of circles and would like a membership book, feel free. There's 5 here. Be sure and pick up one if you'd like one. You're welcome to do that. Can't think of anything else. Is there any more news? Suzanne where's Suzanne? There she is. Next month, we'll be bringing some past books that were on our list that will be available. So if you're interested, be sure and look for that. We'll have them out on a table here next month in October, so they'll be available. Okay, are we ready? Okay. We are very honored today to have Rudy Ruiz. Yes. He is an award-winning author. He's an advocate and a social entrepreneur. He was born in Brownsville, Texas. He's a son and grandson of Mexican immigrants. He earned both his master's and bachelor's degrees at Harvard University, where he had his earliest works published. In reading about him, it was so impressive, and I felt I could take the whole time myself and just talk about him, but you didn't come to hear that. Let's hear what he has to say. Rudy?
Thank you, Ruiz. Appreciate the introduction. And thank you all for having me here in your literature circle. It's a real honor. I wanted to also thank the Hensleys for introducing me to the literature circle. I guess I've known Mrs. Hensley for a very, very long time, since she taught our children piano, so from an early age.
Excuse me, could you put the mic a little closer?
Closer? Okay.
Somehow, I don't know
Maybe a little bit. Is that
Thank
a
you.
little bit better? Okay. Excellent. Well, we're here today to talk about the resurrection of Fulgencio Ramirez. That is this book right here. And I'm very grateful to have that opportunity. This book is very near and dear to me. It had a long journey from when I began it to it being published. And unfortunately, when it was published, it was in the middle of the pandemic. So this is actually one of the first times I've had an opportunity to meet with people in person and talk about the book. So when the book came out, we did everything online through Zoom, and everything was virtual. And that was really nice in the sense that, I got to talk about the book with people from all over the country without actually having to travel everywhere. But there's no substitute, as we know, for in-person interaction, getting to talk about the books. So I thought I might begin with reading a passage from the book, and then kind of get into talking a little bit about the themes in the book and what the book is all about. And then, of course, take questions, kind of chat, converse about it. Several of you have already come up to me and talked to me about how the book touched you, and so I'd be curious to hear more about that. Always want to listen to how readers respond to the work. So I'll begin. Chapter 1, 1986. The obituaries were always the first thing he turned to in the newspaper. He started doing it the day he learned she'd married another man. There, in the still cool blue of the breaking dawn, in the shadowy, unlit recesses of his dank and dusty old drugstore, he sat high behind the elevated counter, perched on the ripped vinyl cushion of an old stool. He wiped his black horn-rimmed reading glasses on his white Guayabera, first the left lens, then the right. He plopped them firmly on the prominent arch of his hawk-like nose. As was his habit, one he learned from his grandfather, God bless his soul, he licked his left index finger religiously before turning each page. Although he knew from experience that the obituary section would be buried in the back, he still worked his way slowly through the town rag. World news, the national scene, sports, all he had lost interest in about 25 years earlier. The feeling of suspense coiled tightly in his chest, his heart beating a little harder as he paged to the last section, the one with the obituaries at the end. But still, he flipped methodically through the broadsheets. Floods, murders, elections, all these were irrelevant to him. All that mattered was the tiny newsprint on the last page. But still, he flipped through, just in case the death he was waiting for had miraculously made the headlines. For years he had wondered sitting there beyond the fortress-like barrier of the pharmacy counter, in the shadows of the sun rising over the gleaming dome of Market Square, how the news would come. Would the man die suddenly of a massive heart attack? Would he be struck by one of the city buses that careened past his storefront day after day? Or would it come slowly? Would cancer or liver disease silently suck the life from his withering body? He did, after all, have a reputation for drinking tequila and smoking cigarettes of the filterless kind. Or would he be killed purposely by another man, a man bearing a grudge perhaps, the husband of one of his jilted lovers? In the end, it wouldn't matter how or why. All that mattered was when. And when the time came, he had told himself for years, he would not shed a tear for the man he once called his friend, for the boy he once ran with on the streets of La Frontera. So a pause there kind of sets the scene. And, driving over here today, I thought a lot about the theme of just resurrection. Coming to your beautiful church here, resurrection is just such a powerful theme, in our lives. And it's really all about faith and love and renewal. And on a very human level, second chances. I think we all have, things maybe in our life that we look back on and we wonder, well, if I would have taken this path, how would things have unfolded differently? And that's really the story and the state that Fulgencio Ramirez finds himself in when we begin the book. He's really a man who's basically been dead for 25 years. His life has been on hold. His heart is broken. And he's been waiting, patiently waiting for the chance to make amends and set things right and recapture the love of his life. And, as we go into the story, it starts going back and forth through time. In the 1980s, he is finding this opportunity to live again. He, of course, when he reads this day, after so many years of looking at it, eventually, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler, but it's at the end of the first chapter, he finds that the 22-lettered man that he's been searching for in the obituaries has died, and he, embarks on his quest. I'll share a little excerpt from that as well. So this is right after he has read the obituary, his eyes blurred in disbelief at the sight of the name, and his left hand clutched hard at his chest as he leaned into the paper to stumble over the phrases. Dead at the age of 46, survived by his wife, no children, no pallbearers. His hands quivered as the paper slipped from his fingers, floating like a parachute towards his feet. No picture, no excuses, no glory. Just 22 letters sitting on the floor of the funereal drugstore. His glasses cracked when they fell on the tile. Dazed, he searched his stunned mind for what to do next. For the first time in what seemed like forever, he would vary from his routine. There was no time to line up a relief pharmacist. He simply had to close the store for the day. His daily parade of viejitos and charity cases would no doubt be surprised by his absence. He had kept that store open for 24 years since he roared back into town. His little paper, his diploma, which kept vigil behind the counter, hung on the side of a shelf. Work was all he had known, filling prescriptions, helping the needy, dispensing herbs when the Medicaid gave out. And now he stood mute and dumbfounded, gawking at himself as if he were contemplating a complete stranger in the small mirror over the porcelain pedestal sink in the corner. He watched himself lower his tan Stetson hat over his wavy black mane. His hazel eyes squinted as he straightened out his thick mustache. His image passed like a translucent ghost across the glass pane of his storefront door swinging shut. Bus brakes exhaled their squeaking lament, and the doors to City Hall creaked open across the street as the beggars and drunks skulked into the ancient alleyways. In his khaki overcoat and matching hat, he stepped through the mist of his own breath like a smoldering beast, rekindled and unleashed on that crisp December morning. He moved with an elegant determination past merchants sweeping their doorsteps, their puzzled faces turned to follow him. Doing the mental math, it dawned on him that this morning marked 25 years since the day he lost her, and now she was free again. Turning the corner, Fulgencio noted the presence of Maria de la Luz Villarreal, appearing 60 years younger than in her obituary photo. She accompanied her weeping daughter on a wrought iron bench beneath the Spanish arches of Market Square. Weighing whether to pay his respects, he decided it was more respectful to allow them time to grieve. As he strode by, however, he overheard her tell her daughter, "There goes Fulgencio Ramirez. Que distinto se ve. How's that, Mama? How does he look different?" She dabbed mournfully at her mascara-streaked eyes with an embroidered handkerchief. "Maybe the maldición is finally lifting," La Señora Villarreal whispered reverentially. "He looks, pues, he seems alive." So, in just a few pages, his resurrection begins, and we see that we're living in a kind of entering a magical world, one in which the lines between the living and the dead are blurred. Just like in the story, his back and forth through time, his back and forth across the border to Mexico, blurs those borders as well. And in this magical, mystical border town that I conjured up in the book, I call it La Frontera, which means the border. And I based it really on my own upbringing in Brownsville, Texas, and Matamoros, Mexico, which is the sister city right across the Rio Grande. And so for me, writing the book was a little bit of a trip down memory lane. The character, when I described the pharmacist, was really inspired by my own father, who I dedicated the book to, and he passed away in 2015 before the book was published, but he actually did read one of the earlier manuscripts. And I was very blessed as a child growing up on the border that I had some amazing storytellers in my family. One of them was my father, and another one was my maternal grandmother, who lived in Mexico in Matamoros pretty much, most of her life, and who I spent a lot of time with growing up. She was like a second mom to me. And the stories they shared gave me a love of storytelling from a very early age, an appreciation for how this oral tradition, of handing down our stories of our families and our hometowns and our communities can be so special and such a bond. It was a very special bond that I formed with both my dad and my grandmother, listening to their stories, and I never got tired of it. And at some point, as I grew up, my dad told me more and more stories, and eventually it came out that his heart had been broken when he was a youngster, and I think he always carried a torch for this high school sweetheart of his, and of course I don't think my mom was too happy about that. My mom was so fantastic that she never has begrudged me, concocting this story and kind of fictionalizing things. And really what led me to think is, I don't know about you all, but for me it was a process of, as I grew older, trying to figure out who I thought my father was. Even though he shared a lot of stories with me and he was very loving, I also felt that there was a lot that went unsaid about his life, and I was always trying to kind of, figure him out. He was somewhat mysterious, like Fulgencio. And what drove him, and what caused him to, in a way, cause a lot of suffering for himself over the course of his life. And I wondered at some point, I wonder if his life would have been different if he'd been able to overcome some of his own internal obstacles. And so that's where the book starts out, really being about resurrection and second chances. I think that's another theme that's very prevalent in the book is the obstacles that we have in our lives that we need to overcome in order to find that renewal, in order to find that redemption, in order to find fulfillment in our lives. and live our lives to the fullest. And those obstacles are both external and internal. And for Fulgencio, the external obstacles are pretty clear. He's growing up in the 1950s on the border, and he falls in love with an Anglo girl who's the daughter of the local pharmacist, who's a well-to-do pillar of the community, because back in those days, the pharmacy downtown was sort of like, the place to be, and it had the soda counter and the soda fountain, and people gathered there, and so forth. So here's Fulgencio, the son of impoverished immigrants from Mexico. He lives on the wrong side of the tracks, and he falls in love with, the captain of the cheerleaders, the beautiful daughter of one of the pillars of the community, and she attends private school. And so suddenly, we are taken back in time to when he met her, and it kind of like, it did, somewhere in chapter 2, described that he felt kind of like he'd been sleepwalking through his life until the moment he met her, and suddenly he felt alive for the first time, and he felt awake, and he felt very motivated to make something of himself. And what he wanted to make of himself was someone worthy of Catalina. Catalina Mendelssohn is his the love of his life. So he, they fall in love, and they have a very sweet relationship, but a young sweet relationship. And I think she realizes he thinks he has to become basically just like her father in order to be worthy of her. And she tells him that's silly. He doesn't have to do that. He can be his own person, but he insists. He's stubborn, and he follows his path and becomes a pharmacist just like her father, so that he can provide for her. But in the process of pursuing all that, he also loses her. And that is actually something that really happened to my father, at least the way he told it. I've never talked to his high school sweetheart, so I don't know her side of the story, but he did go off, and my dad became the first in his family to go to college, and got his degree in pharmacy from the University of Texas at Austin, and again shared some amazing stories about those times where, he was from a poor family, and just like Fulgencio in the book, he basically made a deal because he wanted to lift himself up out of his poverty. You may recall that Fulgencio makes a deal with the headmaster of the local boys' Catholic school, and in exchange for being able to attend the private school, which his parents can't afford, he mows the football field and has this job, and that pays for his tuition. And that is actually one of the stories my dad told me that was a true story of how he paid his way through high school. And then later he worked 2 jobs similar to Fulgencio through college to pay his way through college. I remember when he told me he and like 2 or 3 other young men from the valley, from the Rio Grande Valley, that were attending UT back in those days, the late 1950s, they roomed together, and they basically, all they could afford was that in this house that rented out their back porch, they had 3 cots in the back porch of this little house, and that was where they slept. And then he got up in the morning, he opened a little diner, which there's a diner in the book called Buzzy's Diner, and he would go in the mornings like 5 a.m., open up the diner. He was a short order cook making breakfast, and then he went off to class after that. And then after school, he got a job at a pharmacy so he could keep doing that kind of work. So it was very hard, a tremendous work ethic that it took to lift, I think, himself out of poverty and give my generation, myself and my brother, a chance to go further, and do more. And he instilled it in us from a very early age through these stories, I think, the stories that stay with you and motivate you and when I would get down or disappointed, I would definitely think of those stories and pick myself up and say, hey, don't be lazy, You have to get yourself there, you have to go, you have to work harder, you have to stay up all night if that's what it takes. Because he did it, so, I have to do it as well. So, in the story, he faces those external obstacles that he has to overcome. There's poverty, there's discrimination, there's people that don't look fondly back in the 1950s, early 60s, at Fulgencio having this relationship with Carolina Mendelssohn. But ultimately, it's not so much the external obstacles that ultimately get in his way. It's really his internal obstacles that he fails to overcome, and he kind of self-destructs in his relationship. And the internal obstacles are kind of twofold. There is this curse that the book talks about, this maldición, and the curse haunts the men in his family. And it has haunted them for generations, and he needs to figure out, how do I break this curse? And the curse is that they're doomed, the men in his family are doomed to lose the ones they love most. So all their relationships are destined to fail. And the other side of his internal obstacles is this machismo that he carries inside of him. And the machismo is really wrapped up with the curse. The curse really kind of embodies the machismo in a way, but it kind of symbolizes it as a multi-generational, I know it's kind of a buzzword right now, but kind of like multi-generational trauma, where it gets passed down from generation to generation, this machismo. And the machismo is basically rooted, as I kind of thought about it, read about it, and was writing the book, I really felt it was kind of rooted in a deeply seated insecurity that almost seemed to me came from feeling not worthy enough, of something, of somebody's love, of giving another person your full trust. And that insecurity, as I explored it in the book, I felt in describing this curse came from historically generations earlier, something that had happened in the family. And what happened in this case was that the Rio Grande became the border between the US and Mexico, and there was a tragic tale of his ancestors, the head of the household, his great-great-grandfather, I believe, going off to fight some people who had come and squatted on his land on what was now the US side of the border. And his wife pleaded with him to not go, not risk his life. She was pregnant. She didn't want him to go, get killed over there. And sure enough, he went, and he didn't listen to her, and his pride and his arrogance and his machismo got the best of him. And he went across the river and got himself killed. And then she hurls herself into the Rio Grande, despondent and brokenhearted. She basically hurls herself in the Rio Grande and she dies in the river. And then her mother, in her grief, kind of creates this curse. So it's an interesting mechanism that's part of the story, that's part of the style that is called magical realism, where I make kind of magic and the supernatural and ghosts and things like that, just a part of the fabric of the story in a way that's not too startling or surprising or scary. It's really just what people are accustomed to in their lives. The idea of the machismo really came from my own inspiration of when I thought about how my father had kind of hurt himself in life, and it was this machismo that had kind of, when he told me these stories about why the relationship with him and his girlfriend hadn't worked out, it was because of his machismo. That's kind of how it happens in the story. He doesn't trust her, and he makes mistakes. And his anger gets the best of him. And then when I would think about what had afflicted the relationship my father had with my mother, it was basically the same thing. It was like, oh, he didn't learn from this horrible mistake that he's regretted his whole life, and he's still making my mom miserable, 30 years later or whatever. And so I thought, how different could his life been if he had figured this out for himself and overcome this internal obstacle of the machismo. Similarly, the idea of the curse was brought also by real life experience. Somebody earlier asked me, was the curse real? And I don't know if the curse is real, but I will say that I have an aunt, my tia Ninfa, who is my dad's younger sister. She was the only girl in the family. There were 5 boys and there was 1 girl. And these 5 boys were all very macho, they were violent, they were angry, they were possessive, and they made their sister's life living hell, as you could imagine. So if she went to a dance back in those days, in the early 60s, if they saw her dancing with some boy that she shouldn't be dancing with, they would go and they'd extricate the boy, take him outside, give him a good pummeling. I mean, it was crazy. And so she came to that conclusion that the whole story of the curse in our family actually sprouted from my aunt. My aunt said that she believed that there was a curse on all the men in the family because generation after generation, all the stories seemed to line up. And all the men had been like this, So I thought, well, I need to figure out how to break this curse, because otherwise my life's going to go down the tube. And I think writing the book was really a very therapeutic process, like I said, trying to understand where I was coming from, trying to understand my father, trying to understand even just geographically, culturally, my own upbringing, because when you're in it, it's very hard to get that perspective. And yeah, I think it helped. I think it actually helped me personally to overcome some of those internal obstacles myself, and see, at least when you can see what's going wrong, then you can try to catch yourself, in correct course. For Fulgencio, he has a lot of time to reflect, as you know, all these years he's been waiting. And so during that time, he works on bettering himself, and he also works on finding an answer to how to break the curse, which is something that he has a very good friend, his mentor, who was the principal at the high school that he attended. And that character, Brother William, becomes like this, almost like a second father figure for him that really helps him both in life to reach his goals, and then after he himself passes away and crosses the metaphorical, border to the afterlife, he comes back and continues to help Fulgencio. And once he's on the other side, he basically says, now I can help you figure out the curse, because he can talk to other spirits and he can come back and basically report to Fulgencio, this is what you have to do. You have to do the X, Y, Z to break the curse. So Fulgencio has all this time to do this, and then at the end he gets his chance to reconnect with Carolina, and then of course there's surprises there too. Nothing goes as smoothly as one would hope. But in the end, I think what I would consider the third theme, I think that's very important is, first was the idea of resurrection, second was the obstacles that he had to overcome, and third was healing. And I think one of the things that the book talks about is the healing power of love. And I always thought it was this great irony that the character is a pharmacist, and he sits there all day surrounded by medicine, healing potions and concoctions and whatnot. But really what he needs healed is not something medicine can fix. It's something that only the human heart can fix. And so in his case, I think what I'm trying to get at is sometimes the healing process is a multi-generational process that each generation tries to learn and apply certain things and heal certain things that maybe they experienced as children or that the previous generation sort of had experienced. In the case of the resurrection of Fulgencio Ramirez being set on the U.S.-Mexico border, there's also this issues that are part of the legacy of a war that happened almost 200 years ago, 107 years ago. And when that border was created, we're not really taught this in school, but when the border is created, it has the kind of ramifications that are still being dealt with today. Still we deal with refugees at the border, we deal with the challenges with immigration. So I think in the book, as you get towards the end of the book, it's really trying to get at the idea of how do we heal on the border, and how do we learn to bridge, build bridges and bridge cultural gaps and create a more harmonious existence for ourselves and with our neighbors and together. And there's a character at the end that really, Fulgencio and Carolina's relationship, I don't want to say too much in case anyone's still reading or hasn't finished the book, but it becomes a symbol of that kind of healing, the relationship. And then they have a child that is named Paloma, who I actually named after my own daughter. And that daughter has a vision of the future. She's an architect, and she has this vision of building a city that spans the river, and that people can meet in that city from both sides of the border and be one people and be harmonious. And interestingly enough, this place that she envisions is a place just like these magical ranch lands that Fulgencio grew up on, where the line between the living and the dead is blurred, just like the border between the two countries is blurred. And so in this city, they can be together with their loved ones that have already passed away. And that is kind of, how the book kind of comes to its conclusion, with that kind of vision of unity that blurs all these borders, physical and supernatural, and really transcends and provides this kind of vision of how healing can make us whole. So that's kind of the story there. A lot of the elements, like I said, were true, but it is ultimately fiction. It is a novel. One of the little details that actually I wanted to share with you is I wrote the book, the first draft of this book, 20 years before I got the book deal for the book. I had always wanted to be a writer and had written short stories, and I had always thought I needed more life experience before I could really kind of go for it and write a novel. And the day that my wife Heather and I brought our daughter Paloma home from the hospital, she was our firstborn, I remember clear as day walking up the stairs at our house to take her up to her nursery, and it was like a lightning bolt hit me, and I was carrying her up the stairs, and I thought, oh my God, I know what story I have to write. And I think it was becoming a father that helped me immediately have this epiphany that I have to write a story inspired by my father. And I think I understood suddenly that I just got this different perspective. Life was no longer just about me, and it was about, there were bigger things than myself. And, so while my wife and our daughter were recovering, my wife had a C-section. It was, one of those recovery periods. She was resting, the baby was sleeping, and I was writing through the night, and I wrote, in 3 weeks I wrote half the book, and then I finished the other half in the next, 2.5 months. And then I spent 20 years trying to get it published while raising our daughter and our son, and having a lot of wonderful times. And published other things along the way, but finally, when this book came out in 2020, my daughter was graduating from college. So it was quite a journey, and I'm excited and happy to be able to share a little bit with you of it. And I'd love to open it up and hear what questions or comments or thoughts you guys have. I think there's a lot of good material to converse about and dialogue about. So thank you guys again for having me. And we have a question?
Oh, no, I just love the book. I like the blurring between the lines and have the comfort factor of the characters of the book. The comfort factor of talking to someone who's dead, because they're still there, conversation going on. But the classical hubris, the pride and the machismo are aligned, not completely, but it's kind of the same thing. And the crack in machismo, your daughter, when this emphasis went to her a little bit more than just yourself. But Fulgencio carried that pride all those years of waiting for the man to die. He never admitted all of the things that he did not do to try to correct the relationship earlier. And that just kind of amazed me.
Yeah, he was very obstinate. He didn't understand, I think, that he was wrong.
He didn't read the letters she wrote to him.
Right.
He didn't try to understand any other circumstances. He took it for his first evaluation of what it was, and then he lived with it for 20-something years.
Yeah, he was, and what was interesting was that, he still had hope. I mean, he had hope, but it just took him a long time to start processing the damage that he had done and kind of learn that he had to be different the next time around. And I think part of it where he learns is where his community, I think his friends helped him a lot, because this brother William is the character who was his mentor, and then he has a couple other friends, his pharmacy delivery man, and his brother, and so there's various people that kind of advise him and keep him company. And ultimately, though, I think it was reconnecting with Catalina and having these conversations with her and coming to understand how wrong he had been. Of course, if I could have written it differently. Like he could have done it right away. Like he should have read the letters and he should have.
No, that was a part of the wonderful suspense of the whole thing.
Yeah, but the drama that he let all these years go by. And I think what's interesting about that is it's not, I think sometimes I think about, gosh, is that realistic? But then it really kind of is in the end, because so many things happen in our lives where we just move on because we have to, and then we don't realize that the years just fly by, and then suddenly it's a decade later or 2 decades later, and you're like, wow, I haven't talked to so and so in 20 some years, and what was it that we had that falling out about? Can't even remember.
I thought Brother Williams was Irish, right?
Yes.
An Irishman. And he spent all that time trying to get to know the people he was going to serve. So he understood a lot about Fulgencio and that culture that he came to serve, which was so strikingly different from the man who was the head of the school at the time.
Yes. Brother William is based on also a real person, because since my father really did go to the high school is called St. Joseph's Academy in Brownsville. It's also where I went to high school, and it is run by Order of Marist brothers. Most of the brothers back in those days seemed like they were coming from places like Ireland. They'd go through New York, and the Marist brothers have a training kind of campus up in a place called Esopus, New York. I think it's like in the Hudson River Valley. And then they would get shipped off to, assigned to where they were going to go. And there was actually a real Brother William Vessels, was his last name. I remember it well because my dad would talk about him. And Brother William he was Irish immigrant, but the way my dad described him, he had this real affinity for the culture, the Mexican culture, and he respected the boys, and he was trying to teach them in a time and a place where I guess a lot of society might have been saying you're lesser than. He was trying to help them, find pride in themselves, but in a positive way. He did it through things like sports, and football was what Fulgencio played, which is what my dad played, and I think he tried to get them to be constructive, whether it was academically or in sports, and find pride and find work ethic and discipline and success, rather than get caught up in negative stuff. But interestingly, yes, he ends up becoming an advisor on the whole issue of machismo as well.
But he just falls in love with those colas. So Because there he goes and he relaxes, but he also talks to the dead. He talks to the grandfather.
Yeah.
The Virgin is very animated. I love the fact that she dances around. And just that whole aspect of culture and understanding, he was comfortable with, he was knowledgeable of.
Yeah, I'm so glad you picked up on that. I love that, and I think it's another example of just the ability to bridge cultural gaps and appreciate different cultures and immerse yourself in them. And he kind of became
Right.
he became part of it. And when it was Brother William's turn to transition to the other side of the border between life and death, he asks Fulgencio if he can do it out there on the ranch, so that if his spirit comes back, he can be out there on that ranch, because he feels at peace there, and he feels happy there. And so he does, and so then he's able to help Fulgencio in his quest, because since the curse was originated out of those lands, the spirits of the people associated with the creation of the curse are out there. One, I guess, special aspect of that, why I think for me it was very natural to evoke this magical place, and a place that had this kind of pull to it, was the lands that are mentioned in the story are actually also based in real history. So my father's, when I was a kid, my father would take me out to this little ranch that he had out there on the Mexican side of the border, near the Rio Grande. And it was a very quiet, peaceful time out there with him, and riding horses, and just enjoying. It's actually very, like as I describe in the book, not a very fertile land. It's not like a type of ranch land that you would, find oil or make a fortune because it was with agriculture, because it just wasn't that fertile. The earth, the soil had a very high salinity in it because of the proximity to the sea. So, however, it was just a beautiful place, and it meant a lot to my father, because he had grown up going out there, and his own grandfather had lived out there. And so those lands, that ranch is called El Dos de Copas in the novel, which means the Two of Cups, which is a playing card in the Spanish playing card deck. And if you look closely at the book cover, and the little upper corner of the heart, you'll see a little, what looks like a cattle brand has been kind of emblazoned onto the heart, and it is the actual cattle brand of the ranch. Of the ranch that my dad, used to take me to at Los de Copas. That ranch was just like in the story. That ranch was the last little piece of land left, or at least with my dad, that had been part of an original large Spanish land grant called Caja Pinta, and that is what the curse, the Maldición de Caja Pinta, is named after that old ranch. That land grant was one of 13 land grants that spanned the Rio Grande, between where the river flows into the Gulf of Mexico and what is now Matamoros. And they originally were granted to 13 families that came in the late 1700s to that area to start the first settlement. And they came from a town called Camargo in Mexico. They had their land grants, and they came this expedition. Basically, there was nothing there, just these 13 families. One of the 13 families was my dad's ancestors, and they had that land. So, interestingly enough, one thing that also is all based in history was this aspect. And when I first wrote the first draft of the book back in 1998, that wasn't so much a part of the story. And then over the years, and when my father became older, he really got into genealogy and the historical research about like his ancestry and these things that had happened along the border. And he would tell me, still telling me stories, still trying to teach me. And so in the end, like when I kind of did when he passed away in 2015, I was kind of inspired. The book had been sitting on the shelf for a while. And I thought, the last few years of my dad's life, this was his sort of hobby, his passion was learning about this stuff. And he himself wrote like he wrote like a document where he wrote down what he had learned, so in his research, so that he could share it with his kids. And I thought I need to weave that into the story, and I need to revisit the book, and I think this is going to be an important part of sort of the backstory to Fulgencio's character. And it was neat because although my dad had passed away and I was grieving, I was spending time with him in spirit, working on the book. And so I felt, again, it was therapeutic process, as a writer, but more than anything, really, as a son, to kind of felt like I was spending time with him when I was working on the book. So it's been a fun process, even now, just to read from it. When I'm describing Fulgencio and his mustache and his Stetson hat, it's my dad. So, yes.
You have a new book coming out, right? Is it sort of in the same, same thing?
Yes. So, thank you for listening. Are you in PR? Yeah, this is the new book. It's you'll definitely see some similarity in the style, of the cover. And this one's called Valley of Shadows. So again, there's a little bit of a biblical, spiritual allusion, whereas the first one was Resurrection. Valley of Shadows, being also a reference to prayer that speaks of that we're never alone when we're walking through the Valley of Shadows. It is a standalone, different, novel, but it's a kind of a prequel to Fulgencio because it goes back to La Frontera, and it goes back to that initial origin story I was sharing with you out on that ranch when the river gets declared to be the new border, and that original tragedy that spawned the curse takes place. And so the protagonist in the Valley of Shadows is a character named Solitario Cisneros. And solitario, which means solitary, is one of those, remember when I mentioned that a woman had hurled herself in the river and she was pregnant and she died? Well, she gives birth to the first she has twins, and somebody births them there on the shallows of the river, and they are the first to carry the curse. So Solitario is one of those two twins. He's the younger one. So he basically inherits nothing. He doesn't inherit the land. All he inherits is the curse. And he tries to flee the curse because the curse starts making his life terrible right away when he's growing up. And so he flees the curse. He ends up being this very skilled charro, riding horses, and he's kind of a gunslinger, and he's fought in the war between Mexico and France when France had invaded Mexico in the 1800s. And so he becomes a Mexican lawman, and he kind of is in charge of this town and out in West Texas on the border in the Mexican state of Chihuahua. And he thinks he's outrun the curse, but unfortunately, just the fact that he has the hubris to think that he's outrun the curse means he's cursed. So he is in a very interesting situation because something happens and the Rio Grande shifts course, and his town ends up stranded on the northern side of the river when the river shifts course. And so he loses pretty much everything he has, his love, his badge, his country, and he just goes into seclusion and he's in hiding. And so when the story opens up, a series of terrible crimes takes place in this West Texas town, and when the town sheriff gets killed in a terrible way, the local townspeople, leaders of the town, try to lure him out of retirement, out of his hiding, because he's really the only lawman, in the area, even though he's retired. And they recruit him to come and solve these crimes and kind of save the town from itself, because the town is kind of turning on itself and about to explode. So it's a really interesting story. He continues with the whole theme of the curse and everything, but actually I feel like there's a lot more magic in it. It's a lot more suspenseful, and interestingly how both of these books have been inspired by my children. I have a daughter, Paloma, who inspired me to start writing this book. And then on the Valley of Shadows, I have a son named Lorenzo, who is a senior at Keystone School this year. And about 3 years ago or so, he told me, Dad, he's always been a big supporter of my writing and would read my short stories and whatnot. And so one day he said, Dad, I'd love for you to write a Western horror story. I was like, really? Why? What would make you say that? And he said, like, well, I just feel like that's something I'd like to read, a Western horror story. I was like, well, that's really different for me. I've never read anything like that. Let me think about it. And then like one day one weekend, my wife and I took him out to West Texas, and we went out to Big Bend, and we spent like a long weekend out there, and it was very like inspiring, just being in the desert. You know, it's very kind of like the ranches that I described in The Resurrection of Fulgencio Ramirez. It's these places in nature where you kind of, because of the peace and the tranquility and the vastness, you know, you kind of feel like the presence of God. You know, you feel connected to nature and, you know, the spiritual side of things. And I was just inspired when we were out there. And when we got back from the trip, I said, you know, I'm going to start this. I got it. The idea came to me and started writing it. So my son really sparked writing The Valley of Shadows, and I'm sure I will be paying him royalties as in his college tuition. Any other questions? Or?
I've got lots of questions, but just two kind of burning. How did you settle on the name Fulgencio?
Yeah,
That's the most
Fulgencio.
difficult thing to get into my mouth. Fulgencio.
That is a very tough name, and again, I don't know, it's one of those inspiration things. It just came to me that this character would be named Fulgencio. Interestingly, I had no idea what it meant or where it came from until after I read the book and I did some research, and apparently I think it's a Latin term, like, and I don't speak Latin, or I don't really know Latin, but there's a word like fulgens, or fulgens, and it means brilliant.
That's my research too, and I thought, is that where it came from?
It was an after the fact type of thing, but I thought, well, that's cool, because he is a very kind of brilliant character, larger than life character. I don't know, how are we on time, Grace? Because I don't want to over...
This is fine. Any more questions, you're welcome to answer. Rudy has agreed to stay over a little bit, so we're going to put him back at that back table. And I didn't know, I thought perhaps somebody might bring a book they'd like to have signed. He also has some pamphlets that he's going to put out of where in the very near future they're going to be selling his books at a special event, so he's got that information. And anything else that you'd like to say to him, I'm sure he'd be happy to visit.
Absolutely.
Whatever time he has allowing. It's been wonderful. I love the sound of the new book, and he has brought a copy that I decided to share with Shelley first to see, since she selects our books for reviewing. I think that would be appropriate for her. There she is. She's snuck in back there.
Excellent, excellent.
So-
Yes, thank you, Ann. I appreciate it. Thank you all very much. And yeah, I'll be back there if you guys have any questions. And the little pamphlet I have is for the new book launch event next week at the Twig Bookshop.
Sounds wonderful.
Thank you.
I think we'll all be reading Before you go, let me just remind you that next month, October 11th, and Martha will be reviewing The President and the Freedom Fighter. That'll be October the 11th, so be sure and come back. Thank you very much.